We're gonna be talking about Australia. Yeah, we're talking about Australia. Yeah, we are talking about Australia. Mm. Well, hello. Australia often have two people per note, with one on the front and one on the back, which is a really gutsy move for a nation of 25 million people with less than 250 years of recorded history. Let's see how that works out for them. 1966, $1. This is the point where I realise that I'm basically going to be critiquing a lot of pictures of her Madge if I keep doing this. Here we have her in three-quarter profile and looking really rather imperious. This is the look of someone who has just conquered a city and is determining whether to raise it or not. Also, she seems to have bust in this, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Moving on. On the back is art by Lonugu artist David Malangi of the mortuary feast of the great ancestral hunter Gumiringuru. I hope I said that right. I couldn't find a pronunciation guide online. You'd think it would be great that Australians were putting Aboriginal artists on their banknotes in 1966, until you find out that they didn't tell him in advance, nor pay him. $2. John MacArthur, army officer, settler, and wool industry pioneer. Presumably not a physicist, however, because that sheep is rectangular, not spherical. Maybe the rectangular ones were easier to shear. Okay. Principally noted, however, as the other person who organised a rebellion against William Bligh. One with slightly less reprehensible motives than I'm a whiny little git who would like to keep banging underage Tahitian women. Slightly. Still, Bligh may well have been one heck of a navigator, but he was somewhat lacking in people skills. Age of Sail mythology notwithstanding, it actually takes quite a lot to provoke a mutiny on a Royal Naval warship, but he managed it. And then when they sent him to Australia, he managed to do the same thing on land. Britain didn't have an official aerospace sector then, so he couldn't complete the trifecta, but I'd really want to put him up in a hot air balloon just to give him the chance. Technically, this means Australia has had a military coup, but I think that shouldn't count under the William Bligh the Colossal Tool rule. William Farrer. Okay, so why does MacArthur get to be wool industry pioneer, but Farrer gets to be father of the Australian wheat industry? He voluntarily moved to Australia because of TB, and apparently that worked out a lot better for him than Arizona did for Doc Holliday because he lived another 36 years there, mostly working on rust-resistant strains of wheat, his eventual Federation strain being instrumental in a travelling of wheat exports. $5. Sir Joseph Banks. My initial reaction was that this might be the only example of someone appearing on a nation's banknotes who had never actually been there, but I checked, and he did voyage with Cook on the Endeavour. However, while hugely important in Australian history, his big contribution was not done in Australia, but back in England, where he was instrumental as a driving force behind the setting up of Botany Bay as a penal colony. Am I boring you, dog? Thanks. The British government having recently lost North America as a destination for their convicts because of that whole revolution thing. The Americans, I think, having decided to collectively ignore the idea that anyone was ever sent there as a punishment. It has to be all about the freedom, because Americans talk about freedom like it is revealed religion and they as chosen people. Anyway, his influence was more ongoing than, hey, this looks like a good place to send people we don't like, as he remained as correspondent and patron of the early governors and explorers. Caroline Chisholm. The wife of an Indian Army officer who spent only 19 of her 68 years in Australia. She travelled there with her husband in 1838 when he was granted medical leave, having already set up the Female School of Industry for the Daughters of European Soldiers in Madras, as the girls were being exposed to bad influences by hanging around their fathers too much. Given who would have been joining the army in the 1830s? Yeah, I can see that. It is estimated that during her first stay in Australia, which lasted 7 years, she placed 11,000 people in homes and jobs, many of whom who arrived in less than ideal circumstances, such as being penniless, being without a job to go to, being without friends or family in the country, or being female. Australia's non-native population doubled by about 150,000 between 1838 and 1848, and so that's quite a high percentage of the influx she dealt with. In 1846, she returned to Britain after making a tour and collecting evidence, as once back in Britain she gave evidence to the House of Lords on immigration and with a couple of other worthies founded the Family Colonisation Loan Society, which would advance half the cost of the fare. By 1854, more than 3,000 people had taken advantage of this. After 8 years in Britain, she returned to Australia, where she continued to advocate for immigrants. You have probably never heard of her if you're not Australian, and neither had I, but I totally get why she's important. 10. Francis Greenway. So you're back, are you? Right. Architect by trade, transported to Australia in 1814 for the crime of forgery. Once there, he was employed building a lighthouse, and sufficiently impressed the governor to be freed and appointed the acting civil architect and assistant engineer. In effect, the first government architect in Australia, and went on to work on a bunch of other public buildings. He may be the only forger to ever appear on a banknote, we will see. However, Australia was going to have at least one criminal on her banknotes because somebody important in the early colony was going to be one. Henry Lawson, writer and bush poet. I think he loses out to Banjo Patterson in the known outside Australia states. Battled with alcoholism and depression, not that I know anything about either, was also the first New South Wales person to be granted a state funeral on the basis of being a distinguished citizen rather than a government figure. 20. Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, aviation pioneer, lost 2 toes flying in World War I. One of the first airline pilots in Australia, piloted the Southern Cross on the first flight from the US to Australia, a 3-leg flight where they covered nearly 7,200 miles, spending over 72 hours in the air. He then made the first successful flight from Australia to New Zealand, the first people to try that having never been seen again. He finally disappeared over the Andaman Sea in 1935 while trying to break the England to Australia record. Lawrence Hargreave. There's a little theme going on here, as both of these guys are associated with flight, though Hargreave is one of those proto-flight guys working at the very end of the 19th century on airfoil designs, inventing the box kite and the rotary engine, which was entirely ignored and then reinvented by others. 50. Howard Florey shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1945 for turning penicillin into a workable drug. Fleming had published on it in 1929, but getting enough of it to be useful and refining it was extremely difficult. Florey and Ernst Chain managed to make enough of it to conduct clinical trials, thereby saving millions of lives, reducing the mortality of Allied wounded by about 12 to 15%, and curing thousands of troops of various venereal diseases. Ian Clooney's Ross. We are going with loose scientific pairing here, as he was a vet, but mostly known, with known accompanied by the largest citation needed I could find, as administrator for the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, that later became the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. Wiki cites him as an architect of Australia's scientific boom. Okay. Amongst Cicero's accomplishments are a bunch of stuff related to Wi-Fi, the development of the polymer banknote, which we'll come to in a minute, and the Australian dung beetle project. Because Australian pasture was full of undigested cowpats, as local insects had evolved to eat the dung of the local marsupials, which tends to be hard, dry, fibrous. And in the case of wombats, cuboid. For some reason I now want to play Wombat Poo Tetris. Anyway, cows produce large quantities of large wet pats that wouldn't be eaten and have to decay. They also serve as breeding grounds for flies and worms, and cows won't graze near their own dung, so it makes it inefficient use of land. So they evaluated, over several decades, the best non-native dung beetles to introduce without effing up the ecosystem like they did with cane toads. And it has worked. So much so that Australians are now allowed to eat or drink outside, as beforehand you couldn't do so at a cafe or restaurant unless they had a fly-proof cage, and also they've stopped wearing those cork hats. 100. Sir Douglas Mawson, Antarctic explorer. It makes sense that the Australians would have an Antarctic presence. I mean, it is right there next to them. Well, next to them as anything is next to Australia. After cutting his teeth and reaching the South Magnetic Pole on Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, he led the Australasian Antarctic expedition to the little explored regions of Antarctica directly south of Australia. This was broadly very successful, but ended in disaster for him personally when, 300 miles from base, one of the party he was with, and the sled with most of their supplies, pulled by their very best dogs, fell into a crevasse and was utterly lost. The 2 survivors trudged back, being forced to eat their sled dogs to survive. It is likely this also slowly poisoned them through hypovitamintosis A, because the liver of a lot of Arctic animals, like bears, huskies and seals, is dangerously rich in vitamin A, and more than one party of polar explorers has suffered as a result. I don't know if this is a general thing, but you shouldn't eat the livers of carnivores in general, or just polar-dwelling ones. But I think it comes up outside of survival situations. Don't think I can get any Chianti here anyway. In any case, the other survivor, Xavier Mertz, died on the way, leaving Mawson to travel the last 100 miles alone. I don't know how well he is known outside Australia because I am British and therefore entirely wrapped up in the mythology around Scott, who in turn I guess is little known outside Britain. Tell us in the comments, please. John Tebbutt discovered the Great Comet of 1861. Okay. Second Series 10, 200th Anniversary Celebration. Now, people have tried plastic banknotes before, but Australia was the first to come up with a successful formula and trialled a few designs before finalising one with HMS Supply on the front. The first ship from the first fleet to sail into Botany Bay and later served as the colony's tender. On the reverse, Aboriginal designs to commemorate the original settlers of Australia a lot longer ago. Polymer notes last a lot longer. Paper £5 notes last about a year before being too manky to recirculate, and dollar bills around 6. They are also harder to forge, and in the Australian case anyway, really pretty. 5. Centenary of Federation. Federation is the thing that the larger and whiter British colonies went through when you negotiate a country out of previously separate colonies. Canadian Confederation happened in 1867. South African Federation was mooted at various points, but ultimately didn't happen until both the Zulu and the Boers had been dealt with. It happened in Australia in 1901, though Fiji and New Zealand declined to join for some reason, and Western Australia keeps making noises about leaving, and actually voted to do so in 1933. Charles Henry Parkes did not live to see any of that happen, but he was extremely important in making it happen throughout a long career in the politics of New South Wales, serving as Premier 5 times. Not all of those governments lasted very long, but still. Catherine Helen Spence wrote the first novel written in Australia by a woman, and also did some social work, but mostly known as a suffragist and a proponent of effective voting, i.e. proportional representation. Apart from that, 3rd and 4th series have the same people on them, so let's skip straight to 4, where each denomination featured a different bird and a different species of wattle. 5. Her Madge. A bit older than on the first one, but doing fine. And on the back, New Parliament House and the mosaic based on the painting Possum and Wallaby Dreaming. Yeah, this looks like a trip. I feel like this is the fiduciary equivalent of the video for Groove is in the Heart. 10. Okay, this is still colourful, but I now don't feel like I'm at a rave in a candy shop like I did with the 5. Andrew Barton Banjo Patterson, the more famous contemporary of Lawson, responsible for Mad from Surrey River and Waltzing Matilda. A survey of his papers revealing previous drafts such as Mamboing Elizabeth, Cha-Cha-ing Florence, and Breakdancing Ida. Dame Mary Jean Gilmore, poet, socialist, and extremely serious looking. She was also a school teacher for a time, which does not surprise me at all. I mean, look at her. Was romantically involved with Lawson for a time, and the next writer after him to get a state funeral. So, you know, all Australians know each other. 20. Mary Ryby was convicted for stealing a horse whilst dressed as a boy. Married almost immediately upon arrival at the age of 17, and after her husband's death built upon his already considerable wealth to become one of the richest women in the colony. The Reverend John Flynn, Presbyterian minister who worked with the Australian Inland Mission to cater to the remote populations of the interior, and quickly moved into providing hospitals and medical care as well. Interested in applying technologies like radio and flight to the problems of the outback, he later started what would become the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia. David Unapion, not to be confused with an urapion, which is what you get when you put an illithid larva inside a roper and have it undergo cerebomorphosis. Sometimes referred to as Australia's Leonardo, the artist, not the turtle, he was never able to fully patent or profit from any of his work. Identified at an early age as extremely smart, he preferred to use classical English rather than colloquial, which was probably necessary if he was going to be taken seriously as the first Aboriginal author to get published in English. Also, he travelled widely, lecturing on Aboriginal affairs and concerns. He would seem to be on the MLK level of activist rather than the angry Malcolm X type. Edith Cowan. You don't see people called Edith anymore, which I think is a shame. Social activist. Served on an extremely long list of community bodies. Most famous for being the first woman elected to Parliament. She only served one term, but hey. 100. John Monash. According to Wikipedia, one of the best Allied generals of the First World War. I know what you're thinking. Isn't that like beating out Boris Johnson to be the new face of Vidal Sassoon? Well, no. These guys don't usually end up on money because they tend to have really bad reputations. Some of them largely undeserved, others entirely deserved. You know, those last two are almost anagrams of each other? Yes. Okay. But sometimes you get wars in circumstances where it's hard for anyone to look good, and World War I is one of those. His first field command was the 4th Infantry Brigade, which, despite protest at his German and Jewish parentage, was allowed to stand. His hierarchy and peers deserve considerable credit for their supportiveness, as this was at the time Saxons were being stoned to death in the streets, sauerkraut was being renamed Liberty Cabbage, and Prince Louis of Battenberg was hounded out of his position of First Lord of the Admiralty for being called Prince Louis of Battenberg. Makes the French bashing in the run-up to the Iraq War look positively restrained. He more than repaid with his confidence, being one of the few Allied officers coming out of the Gallipoli campaign with his reputation enhanced, and after moving to the Western Front and continuing to impress there, despite lingering attempts to get rid of him, orchestrated by journalist Keith Murdoch, was selected to command the Australian Corps in June 1918 as its first Australian commander. This being extremely good timing for him, as the German spring offensives had just about shot their bolt by this point, and he was able to take command for the counterattacks. Just about anybody would have had the opportunity to look good in those circumstances, but having the opportunity and taking it are two very different things. He took it, and his talents for planning and organisation were well applied, coordinating between infantry, air, artillery and tanks, and much more significantly to his men, arranging hot meals delivered right up to the front line, which is not as easy as it sounds, because it is war, and nothing ever is easy in war. Dame Nellie Melba, opera singer. Seriously, who associates Australia with opera? Really? Okay, in all fairness though, from the words attributed to her, she's like the bogan of opera singers. An ochre singer, if you will. To someone planning a tour of provincial Australia, described Adelaide as, and apparently she said this while aboard ship when malfunctioning refrigeration led to her being served soft jelly. Stiff is not usually a word I would use to describe jelly, but I don't eat the stuff, so I can just imagine her chilling in the green room before curtain up on La Boheme with a slab of VB stubbies and a pie floater. In her time, extremely famous soprano, and the lady for whom peach-flavoured toast was invented. Seriously, Melba toast is just regular toast cut in half the hard way. Scoffier was really phoning that one in. Is that how it works? You just cut something wrong and name it after an opera singer? Look, I've made hot dog Tui Takanawa, fish fingers Maria Callas, and Pomo for Pavarotti. You can just call me Bibendum Etoile, because I am Mr. Michelin star. Once a jolly swag man camped by a billabong, under the shade of the coolabah tree. He sang as he watched and he waited as his belly rolled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. He sang as he watched and waited till his belly boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.